The manager's voice carried across the marble lobby with the practiced calm of someone who had said the same words to 100 different people and never once considered they might be wrong. "Sir, I'm going to need you to leave, now." Daniel Reyes stood near the concierge desk of the Whitmore Grand, small boy, asleep against his shoulder, a diaper bag slipping down his opposite arm, and a duffel bag at his feet that had seen better decades. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't argued. He had simply asked, quietly, whether there was a chair he could sit in while he waited for his room to be ready, because his son had a fever and needed to lie down somewhere that wasn't a hard lobby floor. That question was apparently enough to end a career, though nobody in that lobby knew it yet. The manager, a sharp-featured woman named Diana Cole, had already summoned 2 members of security before Daniel finished his sentence. She looked at his wrinkled t-shirt, his scuffed sneakers, the exhaustion carved into his face, and made a decision in under 3 seconds. The kind of decision people make when they've mistaken confidence for judgment. "This is a 5-star establishment," she said, loud enough for the guests near the fountain to turn and look. "We don't allow loitering in the lobby. If you don't have a confirmed reservation, I'll have to ask you to step outside." Daniel didn't move immediately. He looked down at his sleeping son, adjusted the boy's weight gently against his shoulder, and spoke in a voice so calm it almost unsettled her. "I have a reservation," he said. "It's under Reyes." Diana didn't check. She didn't need to, she told herself later. She could read a person in seconds. It was a skill she'd built her entire career on, and it had never failed her before. A single dad in worn clothes, carrying his own bags. No assistant, no car service waiting outside. This wasn't a man who stayed at the Whitmore Grand. This was a man who wandered in from the street to escape the heat, or worse, to make a scene for sympathy and a free upgrade. "Sir, I'm going to need you to leave now." 2 security guards stepped closer. One reached for Daniel's duffel bag without asking. The other placed a hand near Daniel's elbow, not quite touching, but close enough to suggest that touching was next. Daniel's jaw tightened, not from fear, but from the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent the last 6 years being underestimated and had grown almost used to it. Almost. His son stirred against his shoulder, whimpering slightly from the fever, and something in Daniel's expression shifted. Not anger, not yet, but a kind of quiet resolve, settling into his shoulders like weight, finding its center. "Ma'am," he said, "I'd like to speak to whoever owns this hotel." Diana actually laughed. It wasn't cruel, not exactly. It was the involuntary laugh of someone who has just heard something absurd. "That's not how this works. Security will walk you out." What Diana Cole did not know, what nobody in that lobby knew, save for one bellhop who would later remember a small, strange detail and say nothing about it until it mattered, was that in 14 minutes her decision would be reviewed by 3 members of the board of directors, that her employment file would be pulled by 6 o'clock that evening, and that the man she had just ordered removed from the building owned 41% of the company that owned the hotel she was standing in. But that comes later. First, you have to understand how Daniel Reyes ended up in that lobby at all, and why, for reasons that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with a promise he'd made to a woman who is no longer alive to see him keep it. He had chosen, 3 weeks earlier, to walk through the doors of the Whitmore Grand not as an owner, but as a nobody. 3 weeks before that afternoon, Daniel had been sitting in a small apartment on the wrong side of town, staring at a spreadsheet he already knew the answer to. The Whitmore Grand, the flagship property of Callaway Hospitality Group, a company his late wife's family had built over 3 decades, was failing. Not in the way that showed up in press releases or investor calls. It was failing in the way that only showed up on the ground. In guest complaints, nobody escalated. In staff turnover, nobody explained. In a culture that had rotted quietly while the numbers on paper still looked fine enough to fool anyone who wasn't looking closely. Daniel had married into that family 12 years ago. He'd never wanted the business. He'd been an operations consultant before he met Elena Callaway, the kind of man who fixed broken systems for a living and genuinely loved the work. And when Elena's father passed, and she inherited a controlling stake in the company, Daniel had stayed exactly where he was, behind the scenes, unnoticed, uninterested, in titles. Elena ran the board meetings. Elena shook the hands. Daniel raised their son and quietly reviewed operational reports at the kitchen table after bedtime, because that was the part he actually enjoyed. Then Elena died. A car accident on a wet highway 18 months ago. And Daniel had inherited not just her shares, but her seat on the board, a seat he hadn't asked for, and for the first year, barely used. Grief has a way of making even urgent things feel distant. He'd shown up to quarterly meetings by video call, nodded along, trusted the people Alina had trusted, and focused on the only thing that still felt real. Raising Matteo, who was 4 when his mother died, and was now at 5.5, asleep on his father's shoulder in a hotel lobby with a fever climbing toward 102. What had brought Daniel back into the business wasn't ambition, it was a report. 3 months earlier, an anonymous internal complaint had reached the board. A junior employee at the Whitmore Grand alleging that management routinely retaliated against staff who raised concerns about guest treatment, that certain employees were quietly pushed out for reasons that never appeared in their files, and that at least one manager had been overheard bragging about how she read people before they even opened their mouths, deciding who deserved service and who deserved the door. The board had assigned it to HR. HR had closed the file within a week, citing insufficient evidence. Daniel had read that closure report twice and felt something Alina would have recognized instantly: the specific, quiet anger of a person who has spent their career fixing broken systems and recognizes immediately. So he'd made a decision nobody at Callaway Hospitality knew about. He would go to the Whitmore Grand himself. Not as a board member, not as an owner, as a guest. An ordinary, unremarkable guest, the kind whose treatment would tell him everything. The official reports couldn't. He'd booked the reservation under his own last name, because Reyes meant nothing to anyone at that hotel. Alina's name had been Callaway, and it was Callaway's name on the building, not his. He'd packed lightly, deliberately worn the same clothes he wore to weekend trips to the park, and told no one at the company what he was doing, not even the general manager, a woman named Priya Anand, who Daniel trusted more than most because he needed to see the hotel exactly as it treated someone with nothing to offer but a confirmed room and a sick kid. He hadn't expected the answer to arrive within the first 10 minutes. The Whitmore Grand's lobby was, by any measure, beautiful, soaring ceilings. A fountain imported from Lisbon, a chandelier that had been photographed for 3 different design magazines. Daniel had walked in a few minutes after 2 in the afternoon, Matteo already warm and drowsy against him, and approached the front desk expecting nothing more than a room key and maybe a bottle of water for his son. Instead, he found a front desk agent named Tyler, who glanced at him, glanced at the reservation system, and then said, without checking anything, "I'm sorry, we're still preparing your room. It'll be a couple hours. You're welcome to wait outside." Daniel had asked, politely, if there was somewhere inside he could sit, given that his son wasn't well. Tyler had shrugged in a way that wasn't quite dismissive, but wasn't quite helpful either, and gestured vaguely toward the lobby seating. Seating that Daniel noticed was currently occupied by exactly no one, roped off with a small sign reading "Reserved for hotel events," even though no event was listed on the digital board behind the desk. That was the first small thing, the kind of detail an ordinary guest might not register consciously, but that Daniel, trained by years of finding the gap between what a business claimed and what it actually did, filed away immediately. He'd found an unoccupied bench near the elevators instead, sat down with Matteo, and waited. It was there 20 minutes later that Diana Cole found him and decided, in under 3 seconds, that he didn't belong. What Diana didn't know about Daniel Reyes could have filled a book, but what she especially didn't know was who else was watching. Priya Anand, the general manager, was 3 floors up in her office, reviewing month-end reports, when her assistant knocked and told her that security had been called to remove a guest from the lobby. A father with a sick child. Priya frowned. It wasn't the kind of thing that typically warranted a call-up to her office, but her assistant added, almost as an afterthought, that Diana had apparently made the decision within seconds of the man arriving, without checking the reservation system. Priya had worked in hospitality for 19 years. She'd built her reputation on a simple, unglamorous principle. You don't ever guess who a guest is. You check every time. Because the person in the worn t-shirt might be exhausted from a red-eye flight, might be a food critic traveling incognito, might be nobody important at all, and none of that should matter. Because the job was to treat every person walking through the door with the same baseline of respect until they gave you a reason not to. She'd hired Diana Cole 8 months earlier on someone else's recommendation, and in that time, she'd started noticing a pattern she hadn't yet acted on. Complaints from staff that Diana played favorites, that she was warm and accommodating to guests who looked wealthy and clipped, almost cold. 2 guests who didn't, Priya had chalked some of it up to normal workplace friction. Now, standing up from her desk and heading for the elevator, she wondered if she'd been too slow to look closer. By the time Priya reached the lobby, the scene had escalated in the particular quiet way that public embarrassment escalates. Not loud, not violent, but suffocating. The 2 security guards were standing close to Daniel. Diana was speaking to him in the clipped, patient but not really tone reserved for people she'd already decided weren't worth patience. A small cluster of guests near the fountain had stopped pretending not to watch. Matteo, woken by the tension in his father's body, had started to cry. And Daniel simply stood there, holding his son, absorbing every second of it with a stillness that would have unsettled anyone paying close attention. Because it wasn't the stillness of someone defeated, it was the stillness of someone taking notes. "Ma'am," Daniel said again, and this time there was something new in his voice. Not anger, but a kind of finality. "I'd like you to check the reservation system. Room 412, under Reyes." Diana exhaled through her nose, the exhale of someone humoring a difficult customer for the sake of ending an interaction quickly. She typed the name into her tablet, with visible impatience, and stopped. The reservation was real, confirmed 3 weeks earlier, prepaid. Room 412, a suite, not a standard room. For half a second, something flickered across her face, not quite doubt. More like the mechanical recalibration of someone whose read on a situation had just failed to match the data in front of her. But recalibration, for Diana, had never meant reconsidering her judgment. It meant finding a new reason to justify it. "The room's not ready," she said, recovering quickly. "That doesn't change our loitering policy. I'm still going to have to ask you to wait outside." It was, Priya would later realize, the exact moment everything could have been salvaged with for words. "I'm sorry, let me help." Diana said, "None of them." Daniel looked at her for a long moment, long enough that the silence itself became uncomfortable, and then he nodded slowly, as if confirming something to himself rather than responding to her. "Understood," he said quietly. He reached into the duffel bag, pulled out a light blanket, wrapped it gently around Matteo, and turned toward the door. He didn't argue. He didn't ask for a manager above her, though at that moment he technically outranked everyone in the building by a margin nobody there could have imagined. He simply walked out into the afternoon heat with his sick son in his arms, found a bench in the shade across the street, sat down, and made one phone call. It lasted 90 seconds. Priya arrived at the front desk seconds after Daniel had already gone, catching only the tail end of Diana, recounting the incident to Tyler with the satisfied tone of someone who believed she'd handled a difficult situation correctly. Some guy trying to make a scene with a sick kid as leverage, Diana was saying, "Had a reservation, sure, but the entitlement on some people." Diana Priya's voice was quiet, but it cut through the lobby noise instantly. "Where is he now?" "Outside. I told him to wait for his room like everyone else." "Room 412 is a Callaway suite," Priya said slowly, already pulling up the reservation on the nearest terminal. "It's been ready since 11 this morning." For the first time, something like uncertainty crossed Diana's face. The system said the room was clean at 11:04, Priya said, turning the screen so Diana could see it herself. "You didn't check. You looked at a man's clothes and decided he didn't belong here. And then you called security before you verified a single thing." Diana's jaw tightened, the only visible sign that the conversation had not unfolded the way she expected. "I've been doing this job for 11 years, Priya. I know how to read people." "You read wrong," Priya said, "and I need you to understand that today, because I don't think this is the first time." What Priya didn't yet know, what none of them knew. Standing in that lobby trying to make sense of an afternoon that had already gone sideways, was that the 90-second phone call Daniel made from the bench across the street had been to Marcus Bell, Callaway Hospitality's chief legal and compliance officer, and that within the hour, that call would set in motion a chain of events that would surface every complaint HR had quietly buried over the past 2 years. Daniel hadn't called to report Diana specifically. He'd called because the moment in that lobby had confirmed, with a clarity no spreadsheet ever could, that the anonymous complaint the board had dismissed 3 months earlier hadn't been an isolated grievance. It had been an accurate description of a culture, one where staff who complained were quietly managed out, where certain guests were judged and dismissed within seconds, and where the people responsible had learned, correctly, that no one above them was actually watching. "I need the personnel file for a manager at the Whitmore Grand," Daniel had said, his voice calm even as Mateo whimpered against his shoulder. Diana Cole, who had worked with the Calloway family for over a decade and had learned never to question Daniel's quiet requests, had simply said, understood, and hung up. By the time Daniel checked into room 412, 2 hours later, this time escorted personally by Priya Hata, who had spent the intervening time reviewing security footage of the incident with a growing, uneasy dread. The wheels of something much larger than a single bad customer interaction were already turning. Priya knocked on the suite door herself that evening, Mateo's fever having broken with medicine and rest, and when Daniel opened it, she didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Mr. Reyes, I owe you an apology on behalf of this hotel, and I intend to investigate exactly how this happened. I've already pulled the footage. What happened to you today was unacceptable, and I don't say that lightly." She paused, studying him for a moment, something about his calm. The way he'd absorbed the entire incident without raising his voice once didn't quite match the picture Diana had painted of an entitled guest making a scene. "Can I ask, is there anything else I should know before I proceed?" It was, Daniel would think later, a remarkably good question. The question of someone who sensed there was more beneath the surface without knowing what, and who had the professional instinct not to assume. He looked at her for a moment, weighing something, and then he answered honestly, though not completely. "Just do the investigation the right way," he said. "Evidence, not assumptions. That's all I'd ask of anyone." Priya nodded slowly, unaware that she was, in that moment, being quietly evaluated by the man who owned the largest share of the company that employed her, and that her answer had just told him more about her character than any performance review ever could. The investigation that unfolded over the following 10 days was by design boring in the way that real justice usually is. No dramatic confrontations, no shouting matches, just Marcus Bell working with Priya and a small internal review team, methodically pulling together everything the previous HR closure had ignored. They found the anonymous complaint from 3 months earlier, filed by a young front desk agent named Grace Okafor, who had reported that Diana Cole routinely dismissed guests she deemed not a good fit for the property, based on appearance alone, and who had described watching Diana deny a wheelchair-using guest a ground-floor room despite availability. Telling colleagues afterward that she didn't want to deal with the hassle, Grace had also alleged that when she raised concerns to HR directly, she'd been quietly moved to the least desirable shift rotation within 2 weeks, a pattern too specific to be coincidence. They found 4 other closed complaints from the past 2 years, each involving different guests, each dismissed by the same HR representative with nearly identical language. Insufficient evidence, guest behavior unclear, no further action required. The representative, a man named Colin Buptist, then processed all 4 complaints in under 15 minutes each, a timeline that made genuine review essentially impossible. They found security footage preserved on a rolling 30-day cycle, showing Diana Cole on 3 separate occasions making similar snap judgments about guests before checking the reservation. System footage that, notably, HR had never requested during any of the 4 previous investigations, and they found something Daniel hadn't expected, an internal email thread, 8 months old, in which Diana had written to Colin directly, thanking him for handling things quickly after one of the earlier complaints, and joking that between the 2 of them, nothing sticks around here long enough to become a real problem. It wasn't a smoking gun in the dramatic sense. It was worse in the way real evidence usually is. A quiet, ordinary paper trail showing to people who had learned, over time, that the system protected them rather than the people they were supposed to serve. Marcus presented the findings to the board 11 days after the lobby incident in a conference room on the top floor of Calloway Hospitality's headquarters. Daniel sat at the head of the table, not because he'd requested a place of prominence, but because it was, technically, his seat, the same seat Alina used to occupy. Still slightly too formal for a man who'd spent most of the past year and a half reviewing spreadsheets in sweatpants at his kitchen table. Diana Cole was terminated that afternoon, not by Daniel, but by Priya, who insisted on delivering the news herself, in person. With the full documentation laid out plainly on the desk between them, Diana's first response, according to Priya's account, to the board, was disbelief, a flat insistence that she'd simply been doing her job, protecting the property, exercising the judgment she'd been hired for. Her second response, once the documentation made clear that this wasn't about one bad afternoon, but a 2-year pattern, was silence. Colin Baptiste resigned 3 days later. Before the board could formally act on the findings against him, a resignation Marcus noted for the record, but did not fight, since the documentation was already sufficient to ensure he would never be rehired within the Callaway portfolio. Grace Okafor, the front desk agent, whose original complaint had been buried, received a formal apology from the company, a shift schedule of her choosing, and at Daniel's specific request, a permanent seat on a newly formed employee advisory committee, one with actual authority to escalate concerns directly to the board rather than through the department that had failed her. It would have been easy, at that point, for the story to end with punishment, with Diana gone and Colin gone and the board satisfied that justice, of a sort, had been served. Daniel didn't think that was enough, and it wasn't the kind of justice Alina would have wanted her company remembered for. 2 weeks after the terminations, Daniel called an all-staff meeting at the Whitmore Grand, his first appearance to the full staff since Elena's death, and the first time most employees learned that the tired-looking man who'd been quietly turned away from the lobby a month earlier was, in fact, the majority shareholder of the company that signed their paychecks. He didn't dwell on that revelation. He mentioned it plainly, without theatrics, because dwelling on it would have made the moment about him instead of about what needed to change. What he spent most of the meeting discussing instead was a new policy, one he'd worked on personally with Priya and Marcus over the preceding 2 weeks. Every guest complaint involving staff conduct would now be reviewed by a rotating 3-person panel that included at least one non-managerial employee. Every closure would require documented evidence rather than a summary judgment, and every employee who raised a concern in good faith would be guaranteed protection from retaliation, enforced not by a policy binder nobody read, but by Grace's new advisory committee, which now had the power to flag any suspicious pattern directly to the board. "I'm not interested in a hotel where people are judged by how they look when they walk through the door," Daniel told the room, standing not behind a podium, but simply among them, near the same front desk where Tyler had once waved him, toward an empty bench. "I'm interested in a hotel where the person who checks a guest in treats them the same whether they're wearing a suit or pushing a stroller with a sick kid, because that's not just good business, it's the only kind of business worth running." Tyler, the front desk agent who'd first turned Daniel away without checking, kept his job, not because the mistake didn't matter, but because Priya's investigation found that he'd simply followed Diana's example rather than initiated the pattern himself, and because, in the weeks that followed, he became one of the most vocal supporters of the new complaint process, having clearly understood exactly what his own small failure had almost cost someone. The story might have ended there, tidy and complete, if not for one detail that Priya only learned by accident months later. She'd been clearing out a supply closet near the front desk when she found a small, unlabeled cardboard box pushed into the back corner, forgotten during a previous renovation. Inside was an old guest logbook from years earlier, back when the Whitmore Grand still used paper registers alongside its digital system, a relic Alina Callaway had insisted on keeping back when she ran the property herself as a kind of sentimental touch for regular guests. On one worn page, dated nearly 7 years earlier, was a handwritten note in Elena's looping script. Beside the entry for an ordinary weekday guest, treated everyone in the lobby the same today, rich or not. That's the whole job. Don't ever let anyone here forget it. Priya brought the logbook to Daniel's office herself, said nothing except that she thought he should see it, and left him alone with it for a long time. He sat there with the small cardboard box on his desk, the old logbook open to that single page, and thought about how strange it was that the thing which had almost cost him a chair to sit in with, his sick son, was the exact principle his late wife had tried to build her company on. Years before, either of them could have imagined how badly, in one lobby, on one afternoon, it would be forgotten. He didn't frame the page or put it behind glass, he simply left it on the corner of his desk, where he could see it every time he sat down to review the reports Alina used to read at their kitchen table. A quiet reminder of the job that had never really been about hotels at all. It was about the people who walked through the door, and whether the person behind the desk was paying enough attention to actually see them. Matteo, fully recovered from his fever within days of that first visit, would ask his father sometimes why they went back to the Whitmore Grand so often now. Always staying in the same suite, always stopping to say hello to the same front desk staff by name. Daniel never gave him the whole story. Some of it would make more sense when Matteo was older, and some of it about the mother he barely remembered and the principal she'd tried to leave behind. Daniel still wasn't ready to explain out loud. But sometimes, walking through that lobby with his son's hand in his past, the fountain and the chandelier and the front desk, where a new manager now greeted every guest with the same steady warmth. Regardless of what they were wearing, Daniel would think about the empty bench near the elevators, and the 2 security guards, and the 90 seconds it had taken to change everything, and he'd think that Alina had been right all those years ago, writing in a logbook nobody was ever meant to read twice. That was the whole job. Don't ever let anyone forget it.